Our next speaker is Kadri Aavik. She's an Estonian feminist, animal rights activist, and vegan food blogger, and has a PhD student of sociology and lecturer at Tallinn University. Also, she is a board member of the Estonian Vegan Society and a member of the Estonian animal rights organization Lomus. She will now present some results of her research, which she did to evaluate the perspectives of feminists in respect to the interconnectedness of sexism and speciesism. Please welcome Kadri Aavik.
Hello everyone, and thank you for coming. So this is actually the first time for me to present this small research project, and I'm really proud that I can do it here. And as you might have noticed, I've slightly changed. I've changed the first half of the title, because when I submitted the abstract to the conference, then the project was still ongoing, and then I felt that the original quotation that I used there did not really represent the results, and so I changed it a bit. And then this work I've done together with a colleague, Dagmar, who unfortunately cannot be here today. So we collected the data together and we had this idea for the project. And just a bit of background information that I want to provide. As you heard today, probably some of you heard about the situation in Eastern Europe. That many animal rights activists are not really employed in that area, and they really have to do these things as a side project, and that's actually the case for me as well. And this is unfortunately not really part of my PhD research, because the sad truth is that this let's call it critical animal studies perspective is not really considered like a form of legitimate research in the academia, especially in Estonia yet. So I'm kind of like doing it as a side project, and I really haven't had opportunity to discuss it with anyone. So I'm really glad to be here. And I'm sorry to have missed yesterday's talks, because I arrived late and I was really interested to hear especially Lisa Kemmer's talk. I think maybe some things what I'm going to say might repeat that talk yesterday. But okay, so let me start. And just to provide a bit more background information, so basically this project was born out of my and Dagmar, my colleagues' personal experiences, and maybe rather to say frustration as vegan feminists living and working in Estonia. So basically, there are many stories that could be told, but something that happened to us, just to briefly relate, to talk briefly about it, was that we recently published in a major Estonian daily newspaper an article about ecofeminism, where we actually highlighted connections between feminism and animal liberation. And then we actually shared this article in two feminist Facebook communities in Estonia that we are part of. And the reactions that we received in these groups were actually really few, and the people were disinterested and they were skeptical towards discussing human-animal relationships in connection with feminism. And also, just to speak personally, as a feminist researcher working in the academia, it is really frustrating to go to feminist conferences where actually speciesism is never discussed or considered important. And furthermore, at lunch breaks, it is really common that animals and their bodily fluids are consumed at lunch breaks, and actually vegan options are sometimes available upon request, and they might be, as I've experienced, sometimes together with the foods that are like gluten-free or allergy-free or diabetic, and sometimes even I've encountered a situation where there's vegan food and normal food. So that's the labeling I've seen as well. So basically, since we got very little support to our ideas in the Estonian feminist community, we thought to explore this issue further, the reluctance to connect animal concerns with feminist issues. So the focus basically and aims of this little project was to explore this reluctance of most feminists to incorporate speciesism as an important form of oppression in their analysis and their activist work. And I think it is really important to get feminists, of course others as well, to agree with us on this issue of animals, because the academia is really considered to be a very prominent place of knowledge production, and I think feminists really are critical towards many social phenomena, and they do not want to take things as self-evident. And so I'm going to speak a bit further about the reasons why we should be approaching feminists. But so basically the issues that we were interested in this research were the questions: how do they view human-animal relationships, and what, if any, interconnections they see between feminism and animal liberation? And then how do they justify whether and or challenge speciesism? And then also we were interested in their views on adopting veganism as an ethical food practice. And so we basically, I'm going to speak a bit further how we conducted this research. And also I think the broader aim is really important here, to actually help to bring vegetarian ecofeminist and critical animal studies perspectives on human-animal relationships into sociology. So we kind of want to challenge this implicit anthropocentrism, which is prevalent in most feminist sociological analysis, and perhaps it could be called critical sociology of species, that we kind of want to contribute to. And perhaps this vegetarian ecofeminism is a bit confusing, and it should be called maybe vegan ecofeminism, but this is just the name by which this strand of thinking is most well known for, so that's why I'm using it here. So yeah, why then should we focus on feminists? Why should we single them out and hold them accountable? So we basically have this assumption that particularly feminists should take seriously concerns for the fate of non-human animals, and that they should be inclined towards challenging speciesism. And here, in fact, we rely on this vegetarian ecofeminist thinking, and many scholars in that field have highlighted similarities between patterns of domination over women and animals, which I think you have heard about as well in this conference. And so animal liberation, in fact, should be a feminist issue, because patriarchal social order endorses the objectification of women and animals, both. And also important is that sexism and speciesism operate according to similar principles. And then what is called the animal industrial complex, it works as a patriarchal institution, and it really relies on the exploitation of particularly female animals, and exploits their capacity to reproduce. And actually these ideas have inspired the field of critical animal studies. And well, in mainstream feminist thinking, at the moment there's really the prevalence of anthropocentrism, so human is really there in the center and unquestioned, and not thought of in relation to animals. But when we consider feminism, and of course it has its own conflicting strands of thinking, and its own debates, and in this research we in fact really took a really broad approach to feminism, and the people we approached in this project are those who have in some ways in their activist or academic work contributed to challenging gender inequalities in different social in different areas of social life. So we really took a really broad view on feminism, and basically we can think of feminism and animal liberation both as critical bodies of thinking which aim to challenge normative understandings in society and within the academia. And when we talk about feminism, so basically we have to talk about intersectionality, and that's actually a word, just to a term to represent the idea that different oppressions, different forms of oppression are interlinked and cannot really be separated. And this is really prevalent in feminist thinking and research in the academia. And so basically you cannot really nowadays do much feminist research without taking this into account. But, well, as intersectionality is important for feminists, then the vast majority of them actually dismiss speciesism as a form of oppression, which should be taken into account in intersectional analysis. Yes, thank you. Sure. Yes. I'll try, because I do have a lot of material I wanted to cover, but I'll try to speak a bit slower. So more about intersectionality. Well, the way it has been used so far in most feminist work is a way that non-human animals are excluded, and the social is understood only in terms of the human, using the ideas of Richard Twine, who has written about it. And actually, when we think of the category human, it usually remains unquestioned, but it actually implicitly signifies a particular relationship vis-à-vis the animal. And actually, the human and the animal are so-called, we can say that they are relationally produced. And I think intersectionality has potential to rethink and expand ways to think about. Okay, I'll start that again. So intersectionality is really important because it helps us to expand ways in which we can think of these different categories of oppression in research, and to bring in speciesism as an important form of oppression. And actually these theoretical considerations also have implications on our practical choices, and specifically when we speak about food practices. And there are several researchers who have pointed out that food practices should not be thought of as personal and autonomous choices, so they cannot be really thought of as lifestyle choices in the context of the private sphere. And as Carol Adams has said, food choices are always already political, cultural, and ecological choices. So basically there are many reasons why we should think of feminism and animal concerns as related, and animal liberation should be a feminist issue. So just briefly about the research participants. We contacted 31 Estonian feminists who identify themselves as feminist. We contacted them via email, and we asked them 5 open questions, which had to do with their understanding of feminism, their knowledge and opinions on vegetarian ecofeminist theory, and the relationship to animal liberation and veganism. And we basically offered them the opportunity to reply in written format, but also if they wanted to meet us for an interview. And so this sample actually is quite particular, because they are sort of urban people, well educated, and in a way privileged. And I think that's really important when we consider this particular group of feminists. And that also led us to think about how ways in which we are positioned quite similarly to them. And in fact, in Estonia, there's quite a large Russian-speaking community, and we actually made attempts to contact or to find some self-identified feminists in this community, but we did not have success, and that actually says something also about well, the relationship between these communities and the way that we are positioned. And now quickly to say what feminism means for our research participants. So it is a quest towards equal rights and opportunities for men and women, and also more widely, it is a perspective through which to view society and one's own life. Also, intersectional concerns were very important for our respondents, and it was a wider critical project which questioned normative understandings. And it was considered really inevitable and natural for them in their everyday lives, and there was no way to opt out, even temporarily. So it was not considered an extra burden, but rather part of their identity. And so one of our respondents actually said that feminism makes you doubt everything that seems normal in the social organization and within yourself. So these were their understandings of feminism. And when we asked them about their understanding and their views on vegetarian ecofeminism, then actually there was very little awareness of this theory, this approach, and a few agreed with the core ideas, but most of them displayed disagreement and skepticism towards associating animal liberation with feminism. And I have these quotes here, and I'm hoping that you might, that I don't really have to read them out, because I have quite a lot to cover, so I'm just explaining them and providing some analysis to these quotes. And let me move on. So perhaps we could call them discursive strategies, which were used to support or challenge speciesism. And some of them come in the form of sort of these frequently presented arguments, you know, against veganism that we have, many of us have heard a lot. So what they were saying, basically that human exploitation of other animals is natural and inevitable. So meat eating is actually presented as a compulsory institutional norm. And it's also interesting that in this quote, the respondent does not attempt even to conceal linguistically the most prevalent relationship that humans have with other animals, that of exploitation. And perhaps exploitation does not sound as harsh if it is believed to be inevitable and therefore not constructed as a matter of choice. So another one. Something else that they did in ways they presented animal rights, animal liberation, and basically they were upholding species boundaries and human exceptionalism. Feminism, in fact, was understood as a human rights issue, and as such, it was firmly established in the humanist discourse. And so they basically dismissed any intersectional connections with anything that was located outside the human. But then, in doing so, the human itself is essentialized and it is left unproblematized, and it leaves in place and unquestioned human privilege in the species hierarchy. So there's another example of that, where speciesist boundaries are upheld, and so basically references to nature and how it has made humans to be omnivores. And actually, while changes were called for in gender relations in the society on the basis of social construction of gender, and basically they problematized biological and genetic explanations of gender, then suddenly here humans are depicted as inevitably bound in nature and in natural hierarchies. And in the case of gender, they were seen as surpassing nature. And the naturalness of animal use by humans was reaffirmed. So also, this was a minority view, but animal exploitation was problematized by very few of our respondents. And they then emphasized the intersectional grounds for this, and they were highlighting similarities between humans and animals. Now, to talk about their personal food practices and views on veganism. So veganism was presented, and that's also quite a minority position, as an ethical ideal to strive for. And the rest of the sort of discourses related to resistance to adopting veganism as a personal food practice, and I'm going to give an overview of these. And so actually, while in explanations of feminism, the rights and concerns of women and other disadvantaged groups are placed in the center, animals and their interests are virtually absent when expressing opinions on vegetarian, ecofeminism and veganism. And then instead human beings and their interests are foregrounded. And then they also cite reasons why veganism cannot really be adopted. So basically, one way to resist adopting veganism was to think of it and present it as a personal lifestyle or dietary choice. So this is one way how this was presented. And here we see that food practices were depoliticized, and they were relegated to the private sphere, as I've mentioned earlier, that Jenkins and Twine have argued against. And so contrary to feminism, which is presented as addressing gender justice both in political and private spheres and seeing these as intertwined, veganism was presented as a personal choice which should not be imposed on anyone. And also veganism was presented as a source of personal discomfort. So one's own comfort actually takes priority over other beings' lives. And justifications were brought as to why one cannot adopt this lifestyle. And as earlier, when I presented ways in which the respondents understood feminism, the way they presented their everyday feminist practices, many actually take pride in their involvement in various activities towards gender equality on a daily basis, and they actually cited no obstacles which would limit or prevent them from constantly problematizing gender bias in the dominant culture. But then these very same activities, resisting and challenging dominant cultural understandings, and explaining one's cause even in hostile social settings that are endorsed with feminism, are considered difficult and tiresome in the case of veganism. And then there were other explanations, and this is interesting. Veganism here was presented as unhealthy and therefore unsuitable for humans. And it's interesting because many feminists many feminist activities that our respondents cited, they focused on challenging dominant myths and stereotypes about gender on a daily basis. And they used their critical perspective to detect injustices and challenge normative discourses. But all this was absent when veganism was discussed. And actually, explanations of veganism were often based on common misinformation or rumors, which were then used to reject veganism. And in the case of veganism, evidence from medical research is required to confirm the viability of vegan diet. And then here, in this case, mainstream medical research and nutritional information is unquestioningly accepted, not considering, for example, the role of corporate interests and influences in the production of these nutritional discourses. So actually, the vast majority of Estonian doctors and health professionals do not recommend a vegan diet, and moreover, they actually warn people for the dangers of veganism to human health. And so this was basically left unquestioned. Also, veganism was presented as unsustainable. And alternatives, so-called alternatives, were offered, such as lesser consumption and also so-called happy meat and locavorism. And it was seen then locavorism as a sustainable ideal. Sorry, I wanted to display this a bit longer. Sort of an ecological lifestyle was idealized, which involved kind of understanding, which involved pure and organic food and decreased waste and consumption, and products purchased from small local producers. And this actually is supported by the wider, very prevalent discourses of health and sort of green living and environmentalism in Estonia, which does not, unfortunately, include animal concerns, and they are really sidelined in these mainstream discourses. And there's some kind of, in our respondents, let's call them discursive strategies. They actually idealized some small farms and kind of rural idyll and aspirations to turn back to rural roots. And most ethnic Estonians, in fact, trace their roots to the countryside. So with that, actually, in the context of Estonia, often there comes the view that the use of animals is inevitable, and so the humane treatment of animals is advocated. And also, sort of knowing the animals personally is important, although then they will later be used for food. And of course, there's a lot of critique which has been made on the address of the locavore movement, and concerning the fact that it's not really sustainable and cannot be replicated on a large scale. I wanted to make some sort of conclusions and thoughts. So basically, what I find really disturbing here and is the fact that the feminists failed to sort of turn their own critical feminist gaze towards problematizing exploitative human-animal relationships, and then they uncritically reproduced dominant discourses on locavorism and human nutrition. And interestingly, the same arguments or practices that they used as feminists to advocate feminist aims were used to uphold speciesism and exploitation of animals. And when they describing their own feminist practices and things that they do in their everyday lives as feminists, then they were very self-reflexive, and they policed some of their own practices in order not to reproduce some dominant ideologies and ways of behaving. But so, as these were present in their feminist commitments, they were absent in describing human-animal relationships. I think that this reluctance to connect these two issues, it would be easy to think of it as lack of knowledge, but in that case, I would be much more suspicious and to think of it more as perhaps it has some kind of strategic aims behind it, and maybe it can be understood as something called strategic ignorance, which has been used in an area of studies focusing on ways in which whiteness can set itself as a normative standard, and how people identified as white often have strategic interests in keeping the situation that way, in the sense that seeing race only in others who are marked as non-white. And so basically this concept is used to speak about, it is kind of actively produced, and it is used to support white privilege. So in a way, maybe we can think of their reluctance, this group who is kind of, in many ways privileged, that we could think of their reluctance to incorporate issues of animal liberation into their feminist activities as a kind of strategic ignorance. And in this case, it serves to uphold human exceptionalism and speciesism, and it helps to produce and maintain a particular idea of the human. Yes, and so basically, while gender was seen as socially constructed, then species was essentialized by the respondents, and it was always implicitly understood as based in biology. And so the species boundaries were seen as grounded in nature always and fixed, apart from the meanings that we actually attribute to them. And interestingly, in upholding speciesism, two opposing discursive strategies were used. So when convenient, animality was emphasized in humans. So the examples they cited about the natural need of humans to consume meat and the inevitability of being part of the food chain. But in other cases, humans were discursively distanced from animals and their humanity is invoked. So when one of the respondents said that animal rights are not human rights. And perhaps we can think of it this way, that this flexible use of these conflicting discursive strategies achieves the opposite effect, that it helps to see how the category of species and species boundaries, we might say that they are in a way socially constructed because we give different meanings to them. And so they are subject to change, and they are understood differently in different social and cultural contexts. And this also implies that the human-animal dualism, while normative and always implicitly part of the construction of the category of human, is never given or fixed, and it must be continuously reproduced. And just a few words finally about some ideas for possibilities for change or some challenges. I think in the particular context of Estonia, I think the smallness, the physical smallness of the society might be an advantage, because feminist circles are small and they are there are increasingly more individuals who identify themselves as feminists and who have adopted veganism or who are moving towards practice. And also networks of people are very intertwined. So there are many feminists who have some vegan or animal rights acquaintance or friend. And I think maybe one useful strategy would be, when we are approaching feminists with this issue, is to remind them of the historical exclusion of women and the dismissal of feminism. Well, the latter still being ongoing. And so it would be useful to draw parallels with the situation of animals. And theoretically, I think it is useful to talk about how to expand the concept of intersectionality to include animals. And then as a challenge, it is really sometimes very difficult to approach feminists with this issue, and we should think how and under what circumstances can we bring animals into feminist, both activist and theoretical agendas, and how can we more widely accept critical animal studies as a legitimate theoretical perspective in the academy. So, thank you.